So welcome back to me doing these videos about people's health. Today we are looking at the Great Plague, and you don't need to pause here, but just to get you in the headspace of what we are doing today, have a look at this lovely sauce over here. Okay, we have a skeleton dancing around in the middle of the sauce. This is a contemporary sauce from the time of wood carving that someone has added this colour to later. So we've got people dying, we've got people trying to leave the city, City of London in this case. We've got others out here trying to keep the people back because they know they've come from a place where people are infected. And yeah, something we need to keep in mind throughout the whole of this session. Lord have mercy up here. Okay, people still believe that God is punishing people by giving them the plague, and so that is a key hindrance really in them being able to tackle it effectively. Right, just a quick recap about why we're doing this. We want to carry on learning about people's health. We want to finish it because this is work that has to be done at some point, and we have no idea when lockdown's going to end and we'll be able to resume normal lessons. There will be talking in this session. There will be stuff for you to do. So you will need a pen and paper to write your work down. I am also going to try and make this video into a Teams form so I can see the work that you've done. That will also mean that in this video there are less answers because I will expect you to just have a go and then I can review what you've done. There will be a bell sound when you can pause. The bell sounds like this. So when I indicate that you need to pause and have a go at something, that will be the sound that you hear. Right, so first thing we're going to do, I've got this interpretation of what a plague doctor looked like, okay, from, very late 1600s. So this is what a plague doctor would have worn. What I want you to do is to pick 3 features of how this doctor is dressed, and for each feature write a sentence about why early modern doctors thought this would be helpful for them to wear in order to avoid the plague when they were treating the sick. Okay, I don't want you to tell me what we know about why it worked. I want you to tell me why they were wearing it. Okay, so what do they believe about the spread of the plague, and what medical understanding do they have, or in this case not have? Okay, so 3 features, why they thought they were a good thing to have. Go. So, welcome back. Hopefully that wasn't too tricky. So, we're going to go down the features. This is going to be the instance in the video where I tell you the answers to something, because you might as well get a bit of quick feedback, because this is more of a starter activity. Right, so he's wearing a leather hat, and that indicates what their profession was. So people would know in the streets, or people would know when they were going into houses that were blocked off, that this was a doctor. So they've got a mask that's gathered at the neck here, and that is to stop the miasma, bad air, from getting into them, stopping them from breathing it in. That is a key thing that they think, bad smelling air, foul air, they think that's what's spreading the plague. Right, a full-length gown with wax. The wax would repel sweat and moisture, which is another way that people thought the plague spread, or at least another way they thought that they would be susceptible to plague. They tried to stop themselves sweating, they tried to stop themselves from touching, the water and sweat of infected people. Right, probably the most iconic bit of the costume is the beak stuffed with herbs and spices. This again is to stop the miasma from getting into their faces. They've also got a wooden stick. That is to communicate with patients, to examine them without touching them, and occasionally to keep aggressive people away. Everyone knows, as we've talked about with the leather hat, everyone knows who this person is, and people who are desperate and sick are going to want their attention. So they would have the stick to try and bat off aggressive sick people. And then finally, leather gloves and boots, again to avoid their skin contacting the skin of the sick. They didn't know how this thing spread, but they observed that touching people that are ill directly was not a good idea, because contact with ill people meant that people got sick. So that is why they are completely covered by all of this leather or wax covered material. Right, activity 2. So, why was the plague so terrifying in the early modern period? I'm going to go through the 4 headings of why it was so terrifying, then we will get onto the activity down on the left-hand side of the screen. So, it's terrifying because of its frequency. It keeps happening. There were 8 outbreaks of plague from 1500 to 1670. That's one every 20 years or so. It affected towns the worst every time it came, and people are moving to towns, not in huge numbers at this point, but people are moving to towns because that is where there is more money and possibly more opportunity for work. So people have to move into towns because they want more money, but they are aware that, at any time a new outbreak of the plague could hit. Now, the Black Death that we looked at in the first chunk of this course, in the medieval period of this course, that was the first time the plague hit England. And the Great Plague, which is what we're talking about today, that was the last one. So if you think of that period of about 300 years, there are a lot of outbreaks of plague, and people are constantly on edge that it's going to be happening to them again. Right, it's terrifying because of the symptoms. The bubonic plague, which is just one type of plague, but probably again the most well known and the most common type. If you got bubonic plague, you had blisters that grew from the flea bites. Remember, it's actually carried through the fleas, and these would then turn into big carbuncles, which are like boils. You would get a temperature, headaches, vomiting, really great thirst, and unbearable pain, as well as what everyone recognises, these swellings in the armpit, groin, and neck. The swellings are on the lymphatic system, which is where you have glands, basically, and these glands get filled with pus and swell up and they are known as buboes, okay, hence bubonic. Now, 4 out of 5 people who got the bubonic plague died, and death took about 5 days from getting the flea bite to dying. Okay, so it's terrifying because you know that you're basically condemned if you get it, and it's going to kill you really quickly. There's not a lot you can do about it. Right, it's terrifying as well because of its impact, the effect it has. It comes on very suddenly. Mostly it began in spring when it gets warmer, and around this sort of time of year, and then as it gets warmer in the summer, rats and fleas would multiply and thrive because it's good weather, and these will obviously allow the plague to spread. People don't know that, but that is why it would appear in summer. Every new outbreak of the plague could kill between 10 and 40% of the population of a community. So whole families and villages could be wiped out every single time it came, really. Poor people, of course, were the most affected, mainly because they can't decide, they don't have the power to decide the kind of contact they come into with other people. They have to live with their family, they have to live in close contact with other families, unlike the rich people who are more likely to be able to lock themselves away when there is an outbreak. And possibly the most the core reason for how scary it is, no one understands why it's happening. Early modern people tried to understand it. The use of printing presses increased in the 16th century, and people did discuss it. But medical knowledge hadn't progressed from medieval times. They still didn't know about germs and bacteria. So as much as ideas were shared, they still didn't have any clue what was causing it or why it was happening. People still believed in miasma, the bad air. People still believed that God was punishing them by sending the plague, and no understanding of bacteria and fleas and rats and how fleas and rats are spreading this plague is obviously going to hinder how they respond to it. Okay, so now you've got those 4 different elements of why the plague is so terrifying. So what you will do now is I want you to write down the answers to these questions. So, part 1. Of the 4 reasons, which do you believe was the most important reason as to why the plague was so terrifying? Is it frequency? Is it symptoms? Is it impact? Or is it because no one understood it? Okay? Right, pretty straightforward. Right, excellent, fab. So now, staying with this information, how do these 4 reasons link to each other? Because they're terrifying in isolation, but together they're extra terrifying. So I'd like you to choose 3 pairs of reasons and explain how they link. For example, you could choose frequency and impact. So it keeps happening, and every single time it happens, you get 10 and 40% of the population dying. You could choose frequency and no one understanding it. Okay? It's bad enough that you don't understand why something's happening, but it keeps happening. That makes it extra terrifying. So 3 pairs, whichever ones you want, and explain the link. Excellent. Right. So when you've submitted that, I will have a look and get back to you. Next thing that we're going to do, okay? These are condensed versions of the information on the previous slide. Okay, I've just boiled it down to the really essential information that I think we should be able to remember once the session is done. Okay, using the keywords in the boxes and the sentence starters below, write a short paragraph explaining why the plague was terrifying in the early modern period. Okay, so essentially answering the question up here in the blue box. Why is the plague so terrifying in the early modern period? Using this information here, make sure you focus your explanation on. Make sure you focus your answer on explanation. Okay, don't just repeat what is up here, but tell me why these things result in something so terrifying. For example, they believed the plague to be a punishment from God, which was terrifying because. But why is a punishment from God so terrifying? Think of what their lives are like at this time. Okay? So, this information, using these sentence starters, answering this question. Go. Excellent. Right. So, that activity, send it in some way, either through the form or by email for me to have a mark of that. Right, so now, national government response. This says activity 5 because I've taken one out, but just ignore it. Right, so what did the national government actually start to do? So, in 1518, Henry VIII, he enacted the first significant public health rule, and I've got a little reminder up here about what public health is. So, the first public health rule ever was isolation, okay? Something we are familiar with. The idea was that infected people stayed indoors, and outside the houses of the infected people, straw bundles would be strung up for 40 days. If an infected person had to leave the house, they would do so carrying a white stick, so people knew they were sick and could stay away. Now, there were also searchers appointed to collect and bury the dead, and you can see the searchers doing that down here. Okay, searchers again had big sticks to examine whether people were actually dead and to keep away anyone who was infected and still alive. And they were also responsible for collecting money from the parishes, which are areas within a city, kind of administrated by a church. So they would go to a church, and at the church there would be money collected from the people that live nearby the church, and they would use that money to buy food for infected people and take it to them, so that infected people didn't have to leave their houses. So a lot like what the government's advising people do now. Okay, if you are inside, get someone else to get your food for you and bring it to you rather than going outside to infect people. So, that's what happened in 1518. In 1578, Elizabeth I, Henry VIII's daughter, she had the plague orders printed and sent across the country. So, this is where they are using the technology that they now have at their disposal. Okay? These 17 orders, well, there were 17 orders in the 1578 plague orders, and the aldermen and justices of the peace, who are basically local leaders, people that get stuff done, had to enforce what these 17 plague orders were. So the most significant ones, everyone had to say special prayers, because remember, they still think this is a punishment from God. They clean the streets of dirt, and no animals like dogs and cats and any sort of farm animals were allowed out on the street. Now, they're not doing this because they realise that the bacteria is spreading on fleas, which are on animals and rats. They're doing this because of miasma, and they think that, dirt on the street is causing bad smells. That's what's making people ill. They started to hold funerals in the evening to reduce the amount of people that would actually go to them. A bit like now, they realised that occasions where people who don't always normally get together were getting together was something that would cause outbreaks of plague. The clothing and bedding of plague victims was burnt, which is, as we know now, is a really good idea, but at the time it was because, again, smelly, disgusting stuff. They didn't want it around anymore, and infected houses were shut up and sealed for 6 weeks. So whether or not all the people inside were infected, they would still have to stay inside for 6 weeks until the capacity for that to spread to other people had sort of passed. Now, 1604, the government enacted the Plague Act, okay? And this is Parliament, not a particular king or queen. This Plague Act extended the help that was offered to sick families. So you can see up in 1518, the searchers have the job of getting food to sick families, but this Plague Act basically widens the area that local authorities can ask for money from. So if you've got lots of people that are sick in a city, you can get money from the other people in the city, but also people further out of the city as well, basically meaning they've got more support for people that are sick. Right, so what you've actually got to do, read the notes about the actions that the national government takes from 1518 to 1604, and I want you to write a clear and organised summary that analyses the response of national government during this time. So basically choose 3 things that happened, explain why national government thought they might be a good idea, even though they still don't know about bacteria and germs, and how these things would positively impact public health. Your answers should be chronological, so I suggest you pick one thing out of the 1518 section of response, one thing out of 1578, and then the one thing out of 1604, okay? What are national government doing, and why is it positive? Now, because this is basically a practice exam question, I do have an example for you of just one section of this answer. So this example will get you 3 marks, okay? In 1518, national government made a law that said those leaving the house when infected with the plague had to carry a white stick. They did this because they had seen that during the many outbreaks of the plague, the people who were close to the infected people usually got sick as well. They did not have the scientific knowledge to know why staying away from infected people was a good idea, but in making sure sick people had something that made them stand out, they could ensure that other well people would not go near them. This would hopefully stop the plague infecting so many people when there was an outbreak. Right, so that's my example. Please don't copy that in your example, otherwise, there's no point really. So I've tried to just use a bit from the 1518 response, which isn't the most important thing that they do. Okay, there's still lots to talk about. So have a go at that, and I will mark it for you. Oh, where's my dingy bell? Excellent. Right, so that is actually session 2 done. I say that like it's nothing. That's quite a lot of work actually that you've just done. Quite a lot of information that you have just learned and hopefully used. So the next session will be on alcohol and the national government. So Gin Lane and Beer Streets, the sources that some of us in the class have looked at already. They're really great sources, but with more context and background information. So I hope this session was good. I hope you liked how it was much shorter than the last session, and looking forward to getting the work that I know you will do for me.